Hello, and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. I have been studying relationships for over 20 years as a couples therapist, a professor, an award-winning author, and as a wife, mother, daughter, sister, and friend. Now, I'm inviting you into this space each week as I dig into some of the toughest and most fascinating relational dilemmas of our time. If you want to discover how to create vibrant and loving relationships in your own life, you have come to the right place. This is Reimagining Love. Hi there. Welcome back to Reimagining Love. In my clinical practice, on social media, in my personal life, and in society at large, I can't tell you just how often I hear that people are struggling with anxiety. Whether you have a formal diagnosis with an actual anxiety disorder, or if you are experiencing some symptoms of anxiety, it's just so freaking prevalent. And you are certainly so far from alone if you are dealing with anxiety. In fact, anxiety is the focus of one entire class of my In Practice series with Masterclass. And today's episode is a full-blown seminar on anxiety, where we cover questions that I've heard time and time again, like, what is the difference between anxiety and intuition? Is it okay if I just avoid the things that are making me feel anxious? How am I possibly going to change my behavior when I feel as anxious as I do? And why do we have to deal with anxiety in the first place? And my guest for this wonderful conversation is anxiety expert, therapist, practice owner, and best-selling author and speaker, Noelle McWard Aquino. We have lots of overlap in our respective worlds. We're both therapists, we're both authors, we're both mamas of emerging adult kids, we're both clinician educators, and we are both Chicagoans. Noelle has written a wonderful new book called Anxiety Unpacked that distinguishes 3 root causes of anxiety and offers the tools and strategies needed to manage that type. Her book is incredibly comprehensive, but completely accessible. And we go through all of it in today's conversation, culminating in a discussion about how anxiety impacts intimate relationships, what to keep in mind as the partner who is anxious, and what to keep in mind as the partner of the person who is anxious. I think everyone's going to get something out of this conversation, and I'm excited for you to dive in. Enjoy. Noelle, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I admire all that you do, and I'm truly thrilled to be here, so thank you.
Good. Well, I'm really excited to really center anxiety today and have a chance to pick your brain in the service of our Reimagining Love audience here and just learn some good tools, because certainly there is no shortage of things for us to be feeling anxious about these days, collectively and individually.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we go there, I want to ask you the question that I ask all of our guests at the top of the show. Are you ready for the Reimagining Love question?
Yes.
All right, Noelle, how are you reimagining love in one of your important relationships these days?
Well, you named it. It's in my relationship with my emerging adult children, my young adult children. And beyond all the ways that typically happens when you have children in their 20s, mine are 26 and 24. For me, this is really centered around what has been a really painful and challenging episode in my son's life. And he's 24. I got his permission to talk about this today, knowing this question was coming. So he's 24. He's still a college student, but he's been home this year on a leave, dealing with some unexpected life challenges. And in trying to really best support him as the adult that he is now, under circumstances that are very challenging for him and for me too, it has really highlighted for me how hard it is for me to not be able to fix it, to not have the answers, and to navigate supporting him when he and I have very innately different coping styles. And we have really been very much in, to use your term, the splitting the ambivalence around it, where I'm holding all the hope and optimism, and he's holding all the fear and negativity. And I intellectually know and in my heart believe that the best way I can support him and also help him give space for him to feel some of the hope and optimism is for me to be able to join him or at least visit him in his fear and negativity, and realizing how hard that is for me to do because I have to be with feelings that I don't want to feel. So it's really has shown a light for me on things that I have to work on so that I can, really show up and support him. And I've been doing that work, and, he and I have been navigating this and sometimes doing it really well and sometimes doing it very messily and giving each other a lot of grace in that messiness, and sometimes giving myself grace in that messiness, and seeing something really good that I think is emerging from it as we're going through that.
Oh, Noelle, that's what you just shared is really important. Thank you. Thank you so much for, bringing something here that is like in real time. This is what you're doing
Yeah.
in real time. And I want to just like put a spotlight on two elements that stuck out to me so much as you were speaking. And the first is when you described that you and your son have really different coping styles. What I love about that is it's so easy. You're challenging that default of like that difference is a better worse, and you're saying we have
Hmm.
different approaches to hard things. And there's something that
Yeah.
is it's so respectful of his dignity and your dignity. And that I think, especially as parents, it's easy for us to feel like it's our job to teach and change, kids. And
Yeah.
you are saying we're coming into this with really different coping strategies. It's so respectful of his way of being with pain, which is different from your way of being with
Right.
pain.
Right.
And then I also appreciate how counterintuitive it is for you. You're carrying all the hope and he's carrying all of the pain. You've got the ambivalent split as we so often do in our relationships.
Yeah.
And I have so much empathy for, as a parent, it is so counterintuitive to leave hope and visit pain and despair when it's our kid, right? It's really,
Yes.
I think that's a very scary little bridge to travel across.
Yeah.
And I can
And
imagine.
hard sometimes. I mean, definitely hard for me. And that has become really clear to me as we've been
Mm-hmm.
navigating this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that I can imagine that you become an ever more trustworthy support to him when you can, right? When you
When I
can.
can. Yeah.
Yeah. You write really openly in the book as well, I know, with your son's permission about how this is not this is a different variation of, he's had struggles around anxiety for a long
Yeah.
time, which is a large part of your purpose and passion for this work. And I think
Absolutely.
that's another challenge too, isn't it? Like what it looks like to support him at age 24 is not what it looked like to support him at 14 and 8 and all of those versions. So you are learning in real time what this looks like as he is a grown ass man, a full
Yes, that's
man.
exactly right. That's exactly right. And really quickly around all this, my daughter, who's 26 and lives in another city and living an independent life, when we sort of hit the low point in the crisis with all this, she came to me and said, I'm thinking about asking for a temporary transfer to the Chicago office so that I can be at home and help out. And my immediate response to that was, that is a beautiful offer, but I've got this. I can handle everything. None of this is your responsibility. So if you're doing it for me, you don't need to do that. But if you're doing it for you, that's different. And we would love to have you. So she did come home for 2.5 months and was a big help. And I also had this experience of not needing her to help, but opening myself up to allowing her to, and really being able to, in small but meaningful ways, be taken care of by her. That is a complete, paradigm shift for me as a parent also. And, but really honors like the incredible adult that she's become. And, that I don't have to be the parent who's got it all and can do it all, that, there's room for some vulnerability and, being taken care of also.
I'm right there with you. I have a similar situation in our family dynamic, and it's so uncomfortable and so unfamiliar for me to, find ways to lean on our kids or just like be, like allow that support to go in both directions. It feels, speaking of counterintuitive, it feels counterintuitive, but I'm facing some pretty complicated challenges with my own aging parents. And this summer had lots of conversations with our kids, where I was kind of opening up to them about what that was like for me, like what was getting stirred up in me as I'm figuring out what are my boundaries? How do I care? How do I care from a distance? And it felt so uncomfortable to be,
Mm-hmm.
opening up to the kids in that way. But I also could see and feel, I'm sure this is the way it is for your daughter as well. I could see and feel that there's like a pride in being turned to as a support and being able to be seen in that way, like that your daughter
Yeah.
has resources that are helpful, that are different than yours, that are valuable. And same thing, like I really appreciated my kids' perspectives on all of this because they see things differently than I do. And they've known all these characters their whole lives. It was very
Right.
interesting.
Yeah. And it really honors them as the adults that they are. And,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah. It's like, how do we honor without burdening?
exactly.
Which I love how you phrase it to your daughter. It was like, if you are coming home because you want to, that's different than if you're coming home because you think that I need you to.
Right.
Okay, so somewhere amid all of this, you have written this book, Anxiety Unpacked. I want to move into it because I was telling you before we started recording, what strikes me so much about this book is that this is a topic that you know so well,
Mm-hmm.
clinically and personally. And you really, really like from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, you take us by the hand and you're just walking us through. And the book is really sophisticated and absolutely accessible. And I think you have found just a really wonderful place to be with us as your readers. So kudos to you for,
Thank you.
for offering something so valuable. But you start by kind of asking, why do we need another book about anxiety? So why do we need this book, Noelle?
So, this book is a little bit different than any other book out there about anxiety. It's based on a framework that I developed myself in my work with clients that really mostly came from listening to clients. I developed an interest in working with anxiety very early in my career, and I've been practicing for 32 years now. And at the time, I didn't really know why I had such an interest in it because I personally do not struggle with an anxiety disorder, though I absolutely know what it is to be anxious because I'm a human being and we all experience it. And I think everything that I talk about in the book, anybody can relate to because they are human experiences. And I really felt ill prepared to sufficiently help my clients who were struggling with anxiety. So I did a lot of training and different approaches to working with anxiety, found that they all were valuable. They all had something important to say about anxiety. And, they all offered really helpful strategies, but I didn't find that there was just one thing that's like, this is the thing. And if I just do this, then, I'm good. And at the same time, I was listening to clients who were talking about their experiences with anxiety. And even though the details were always different, their life experiences were different, their life circumstances, there were these phrases that just kept being repeated by these different clients. And I started being curious about that and trying to make sense of that. And the way that I sort of came to understand it for myself is that any anxiety a client was presenting with, I could really trace back to like being one of three different types, or I started to think about it as like three root causes of anxiety because, I could take anything they were talking about in the session and trace it back to one of these types. And the more I thought about that, the more like I realized that they each have different characteristics that make them different from the others. They each have a different need that's driving the anxiety, which was really helpful to conceptualize that because it helped guide how to intervene then. And also realize that they each had a different way that would show up every single time with every single client of, I call it the objection, the way in which the anxiety would fight to preserve itself when challenged. So for me, this just became like a framework or roadmaps to help me feel like I better understood what clients were saying in the sessions and how to then guide the interventions with them. It was really helpful to me as a therapist. My clients were reflecting back to me that it was really helpful to them. And so I started sharing it with clients and I'd give them like, let me tell you a little bit about how I think about and work with anxiety. And I'd give them a brief overview of this model. And 100% of the time, and this has been without fail, the clients are able to tell me exactly where their anxiety comes from. They'll tell me I do one of those, but not the other two. I do two of them, but not the third, or I do all three. And, it just became also a helpful way for them to make sense of what was happening and start to understand what was showing up for them. So, because it's this model that presents like these three root causes of anxiety makes it different than I think other books that are out there about anxiety, and just defines it more specifically instead of in sort of this vague term that really it's not a one size fits all problem. It's not the same experience for everybody.
I really want you to spend some time with each of those three types so that people who are listening have a felt sense of the roots of their own experience with anxiety. But before we do that, I want to just check in about anxiety in general. When there's an emotion that's as unpleasant as anxiety, it's hard to think about it as having a function. But we know darn well that all of our emotions have a function. And you teach us that anxiety also does. So can you talk to us a little bit about why are we wired to experience anxiety? And what are some of those like universal truths that you have highlighted or illuminated about anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are all wired to feel anxiety, and it's a necessary and essential function, and it exists to keep us safe and to keep us alive. We are all wired to have an anxiety response. It is triggered by, you know, part of our brain called the amygdala, whose only job is to look for danger. And when it detects danger, it releases hormones into our system. Adrenaline is the one that I focus on because all the symptoms of anxiety that we experience come from adrenaline being released into our system. Increased heart rate, shallow breathing, sweating, we get flushed, we shake. All of that is because of adrenaline that's released into our blood system. And the reason it's released is to prepare our body to either fight off a danger or flee from it. So it's what triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response. And when we face true danger, it is essential. It is what keeps us safe and alive. And the problem that we experience with anxiety, and I'd like to differentiate. So when we have anxiety as a response to a real problem or a real threat or a real danger, it's never a problem and it shouldn't be viewed as a problem. When it shows up in the absence of true danger or threat, that's where it does become problematic for us. And there are these, for people who experience chronic anxiety, they have habitual and often unconscious ways of perceiving danger that isn't there. Because this sophisticated system that we have that keeps us safe and alive does have one significant flaw. And that is that it cannot tell the difference between a threat and danger that's real and one that our mind perceives or our body perceives. Sometimes
That's a flaw.
it stems from the body. Yeah. So as long as we perceive danger, it doesn't matter if it's there or not. Our body will respond exactly as it's designed to do. So I think whenever anxiety is present, it often is present in the absence of true danger. It often is not necessary in the way that it shows up, but it's always protective. And, so being curious about, why that might be showing up for you in any given situation is a really, I think it's an important way to think about anxiety, that it's always there in an attempt to be protective.
There's something so self-compassionate about, rather than saying I have to fix my anxiety or get rid of my anxiety, you're actually asking us to be curious about our anxiety.
Yeah.
Like, why is it here? What is it signaling? So to turn toward it, which actually fits with one of the universal truths that you write about in the book, which is that anxiety, there's nothing that anxiety loves more than avoidance.
Exactly.
Right? So can you talk to us about that relationship between avoidance and anxiety?
Yeah. So, in the presence of anxiety, the most common human response to anxiety is avoidance, which on one hand kind of makes sense,
Totally.
that if we're afraid of something that we want to avoid it. That could be an activity. It could be, something that we need to do, or it could be an emotion, so avoidance can take many different forms. It's the most common response, and it is also the least helpful response. Because we can never overcome anxiety by avoidance, and we can never overcome anxiety from a distance. We can't stand back from things that make us afraid and think our way out of being afraid and wait until we have reached a point where we're no longer afraid and then we can step into the thing. That's just not how it works, but that's how we all wish it did.
Yeah.
And so, it's just automatic often for all of us to have our first impulse to be to avoid, but what we actually have to do is step into instead.
A client of mine was talking last week about an insight that he had about his procrastination, which is a lifelong pattern for him. And he was like, I don't procrastinate about everything across the board. I procrastinate about the shit I really care about, the stuff that I want to go well. And it was such a key insight that this is not, and it was so different than viewing it as a character flaw or a personality trait, but rather it was a way of him protecting himself from the risk of something that he wants very badly, not going the way that he wants it to go and hopes that it goes.
Yeah. And then when you understand it that way, it makes so much more sense and, offers that compassion. And then you can start to think about, alternatives to what you might do instead.
You have this line I love, and on the topic of avoidance, you write, avoidance is always prolonged suffering disguised as safety.
Yes,
Ooh,
always.
That's so good. That's so good. That's so good. The other universal truth I wanted to talk about was the way that you help us get our heads around the ever-present interplay between thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And you remind us that feelings are actually the last to change. So help us understand that, please.
There is this constant interplay between our thoughts, our feelings, meaning both our emotions and our visceral feeling, sensations, and our actions. One is always influencing the other. And when it comes to anxiety, as we were just saying, the wish is always that when I feel differently, I will do differently. Or when I feel differently, I will think differently. And there's no way that I, as a therapist or as a person, can tell somebody to feel differently than they do. Feelings just arise. They are what they are, and we feel what we feel. And it's never helpful to say, well, why don't you feel this instead? Or, don't feel that. So the feelings are something that we can't actively just change how we feel. We can change how we think and how we act, even while we feel a particular feeling. And so often the way that we get to the feeling changing is by, doing the work around how we are thinking or perceiving something or framing something, as well as, attending to the way that we're showing up around that thing. And it's through that process, and it requires intention. It requires being aware of what the feeling is, what the default response would be, that I'm actively choosing something different. And then I'm paying attention to what happens as a result of doing that. It's that process that actually is what leads to the feelings changing. They're always the last to change. And we just need to expect that. It explains why the work is so hard, first of all, because we have to do all this while we still feel how we feel.
Right, right.
And so it explains why the work is hard. And it just, to me, sort of levels the expectation and, sort of prepares you for the work that you do have to do around all this.
There's so much throughout your book. You weave together, you teach us something, and then you show us how it would show up in your practice. And there's so many instances where your client is verbalizing a feeling and you're working with the thoughts and the behaviors. And then you circle back to where is that feeling now? And could something else sit alongside it? Or is there any shift in it? I think that's something that we can do for ourselves as well, right? We can notice the feeling, address thoughts, address behavior, and then kind of come back and check in with the intensity of that feeling.
Absolutely. And with that, also do things that help, take care of the feeling. So, if we're feeling really anxious and our body is and we always feel it in our body, doing things like breathing or centering or grounding, doing things that actually are taking care of that feeling, is also important too. So that, we're sort of attending to all of it. But as you said, having to do the work around the thought and the action and keep checking back in on, how is this feeling and how is that shifting inside of us?
Will you talk us through your understanding of the difference between anxiety and intuition? This is something that comes up a lot in my community. How are they different? Can they coexist?
They absolutely can coexist. Yeah. And they're not the same thing. And I put a chapter in about anxiety versus intuition because I get asked this a lot, and people who have anxiety often think that their anxiety is their intuition. and therefore necessary to, pay attention to. So to answer the question, I'm going to start with a quote from an author that I interviewed who wrote a book about intuition called Trusting Your Intuition. Her name is Robin Pollack. And when I asked her how she would describe it, the first thing that she said is intuition is not fear-based. And so, and of course, anxiety is fear-based. And what she was saying is that the only time you think your intuition is showing up is in fear or to warn you. It's not your intuition, that is your anxiety. And that we have to know our intuition enough. Intuition is always present, it's always guiding us. And we have to have enough a relationship with our intuition to actually know it's what's speaking to us in any given moment. The way that I think about it is that when a person is talking from anxiety, there is usually a charge to it. There is a spinning, there is an intensity to it, and there is almost always questions or stories surrounding it. Whereas intuition is calm, it's quiet, it's certain, it doesn't have stories, and it doesn't ask questions because it already knows. So it really just shows up as a statement of knowing, whereas anxiety often shows up in the form of a lot of questions and stories. So I think that that's one helpful distinction. And then also just the way that it feels. Intuition almost doesn't have any kind of emotional charge to it because it's just what you already know.
I'm thinking about the woman that you interviewed who wrote a book about intuition. And I imagine for some of us, we take intuition into a spiritual place, right? A sort of guided place. But I imagine that we don't need that conceptualization of intuition because as you're talking about it, what it's feeling like is just sort of an inner knowing, that like whisper inside of you that maybe is the anxiety is layered over. Like I'm imagining these layers of anxiety and then there's something quiet. I remember being at a Gabor Mate workshop and he had us do an exercise where we sat with somebody and for a few minutes, we talked to this person, a total stranger, about what is the no inside of you that you are not really particularly wanting to pay attention to. What's the no, not the N-O,
Yeah.
like what is the no that you need to say in your life or enact in your life that you really are kind of like looking away from it. And I think that's a kind of intuition, right? This
Yeah.
inner quiet knowing that there's a lot of story and inner chatter that is anxiety based on top of. And so intuition can be, I think we can have a conceptualization of intuition doesn't have to be a spiritual.
Absolutely. It's just this voice that is inside of us that, when I interviewed her, she, said like, it's what tells you if you want vanilla or chocolate. It's what, tells you what you need to have a peaceful day. So it's always present for you. And yes, I totally agree that anxiety, as well as lots of other things, can easily get piled on top of it, and really obscure it, sort of like clouds that cover it so that we're not seeing it clearly.
Okay, so our three types of anxiety. So you are going to take us down three paths: future, catastrophizing, control, distorted beliefs. Those are our three types of anxiety. So the first one, future catastrophizing. Can you paint us a picture of what this looks like, what this sounds like, how we might know if that is our particular flavor of anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. So catastrophizing is when we're in a current situation and we make up a story of worst case or catastrophic outcomes. And then we relate to that story as if it is happening or if it's likely to happen. And almost always the distress that we feel and the anxiety that we feel is about the story we've created much more so than the facts. This one is really easy to spot because it almost always begins with the words, what if? And everything that follows what if is a story. And it's the catastrophizing story. What if my headache is a brain tumor? What if I don't close the deal and my boss fires me? What if the reason he hasn't responded to my text in 2 hours is because I said something stupid and now he's lost interest in me? And it's all those stories that we, are always creating around the unknown. And that really is the function that catastrophizing serves. Our human brain equates uncertainty with danger. And so, in the presence of uncertainty, It believes that if it anticipates all of the, worst outcomes and potential problems, that it is somehow preparing both our body and our mind for what might be required of it. And that's the reason why we catastrophize. However, this particular, it just doesn't work. I mean, I think if we were truly gifted with the ability to foresee the future and clairvoyance, then maybe it would be useful, but we're not. And so it's really just noise that it is filling in around all of these, scary, potentially bad outcomes that feel compelling, that feel like we have to think about them, we have to prepare for them, that doing so is protective. And in reality, it's not protective at all. It just creates anxiety and stress for us.
That's such a simple tool that when your inner chatter or your conversation with somebody in your life starts with what if, or this might happen, everything that follows after is a story, right? Because it
Always.
hasn't happened. In my house, we call it borrowing trouble. It's just borrowing trouble because you don't know if it might happen. And actually it might completely work out in a beautiful way. If you're going to tell a story, that's another story of what.
Yes. And those are not the stories we tend to tell ourselves.
No, they're not. No. And I also like what you said, because you started by saying our human brain tells these stories, to protect us from danger. So I love how that also depersonalizes it. It's not a problem when any of us who are catastrophizing, that's not a uniquely you thing. Your brain is wired. Part of how your historical ancestors got, evolutionarily here was the ability to anticipate danger. So there's something adaptive about it, but it doesn't mean it is not keeping you safe and it's not preventing those things.
Exactly. And of course, there are people, there's a theory that this evolved like during when we were hunter-gatherers and living in caves, and we're stepping outside of your cave meant that you could face danger either from a predator or a human foe. And certainly there are many people who live in, circumstances where this is still true, like where stepping outside could mean danger. And so again, it's very adaptive and, purposeful when those are the circumstances that we live in. Yet many of us, this is carried forward as society has evolved and many people don't live in those circumstances. Our brains still default to this. And so there's a way in which it still can be adaptive if you live in circumstances. And I get asked that at many trainings, what about my clients who live in, parts of the city where, they do face danger, or there's so many places in the world where terrible things are happening. And my answer to that is like, we don't want to take that away from them because that is serving them. That is helping them to stay safe. It's when that shows up in the absence of danger that we want to get better about, discerning that. And that is the work that we do with catastrophizing, is that discernment of like, what is actually true? What are the facts? And what's the story? And, to turn our attention to the facts rather than the story that we're creating. And, about learning how to be more present to the now moment, instead of in the future, because catastrophizing always puts us in the future. So learning how to be more present to right now, and learning how to develop a tolerance for uncertainty. I mean, those are the three key pieces of work around catastrophizing.
Let's talk about the control. The second type is about control. So what does this version of anxiety look and feel like?
I'll just start by describing the person who, has anxiety stemming from control. They are always, without exception, very successful, highly competent individuals who will describe themselves as being stressed out, overwhelmed, exhausted, but often will not describe themselves as anxious, often don't recognize the role that anxiety is playing in their experience of their life. Control is, first on like a really high level, there is, what's in our control and what's not in our control. And when we overly focus on what's not in our control and under focus on what is in our control, we do set ourselves up to be anxious because we are putting our energy to things that are outside of our power. And so we're inevitably going to fail. So if our energy is directed towards what somebody else thinks, what somebody else feels, what they're doing, why they're doing it, Other things that are outside of our control are governmental actions, acts of nature. I mean, there's so many things outside of our control. So one way that this shows up is when we overfocus on what's not in our control and underfocus on what is. But the deeper work here, and the thing that I really focus on in the book, is when a person has an underlying either belief system or feeling state of I'm not okay or it's not going to be okay. The way that they will, sort of cope with this in order to feel safe and secure is to either try to control as much of their external environment as possible. And the unconscious thought there is if I know what to expect, or if things happen the way that I think that they should, or I want them to, then I'll be okay. There's a strong focus on, how things get done, having rigid expectations of how things should be done, over researching and over preparing because you don't know when you've done enough so that it will be okay. Perfectionism. So we see a lot of those traits in people who have anxiety rooted in control. The other way that people will cope with that sort of innate feeling state or belief of I'm not okay or it's not going to be okay is to anticipate everything that could go wrong and create a plan for what they will do should that thing happen. So it starts with catastrophizing, but it takes it a step further. People who catastrophize just think about all the things that could go wrong. People who have anxiety rooted in control, they think about everything that could go wrong, but then they create a plan for what they're going to do. And the belief there is if I have a plan ready, then when this thing happens, I'll be okay because I've already got the plan. And there's a way in which both of those attempts at control make sense that, there's a way I can see how it could make sense and it could feel very useful. But the reality is that they don't work. We will never be able to control what happens outside of ourselves. And the problem when we are focused on controlling our external environment, it also makes our well-being dependent on what's happening out there, which means that we can only be okay if what's happening out there looks the way that I think that it should or I want it to. And really what we need to be able to do is to internalize our sense of well-being, that no matter what happens out there, I possess everything that I need. I have all the internal and external resources to cope with what's happening, to adapt, and to ultimately be okay. So that's really the work that we're doing, is shifting that sense of well-being from external to internal.
In the process of planning for every possible thing that can go wrong, we are quietly and subtly and sneakily giving ourselves a message that we can't possibly be okay unless everything else is okay. So it really is a denigration of self, right? And it really, the very process of trying to do that further erodes self-trust because it says, I have to do this because there's nothing in here that could keep me safe. And so I really hear you around the path forward, being around helping us see, identify, and feel those internal resources, the ways in which we are trustworthy within ourselves, that we have dealt with unfortunate things before, and we could deal with unfortunate things again.
And that is absolutely true. So it does erode that self-trust. There's this other component of it where there are many people who have this anxiety who say, well, actually, I totally trust myself. I just don't trust anybody else. And so, it's like, I'm the only one who can do it because I don't trust anybody else. And when that shows up, that still is a lack of trust because you don't trust that if you're not the one doing it, that it can be okay. And so the lack of trust may not be so much in yourself, but it's in that there's this way in which even if things are done differently than I would do them, that it can still be okay. And ultimately that I can be okay. So it can be a little deceptive in that way. And it still, does come down to this lack of trust.
Ooh, that's really good because that's a very, very sneaky aspect of it is when it is so externally focused, it really does feel like the other people in my life can't be relied upon. And that also, A, sends a message that I need other people to be okay so I can be okay. And B, it really erodes the quality of those relationships then, right? When my primary focus is making sure that you do things the way I need them done so that I can feel okay, I'm not giving you much space to be yourself.
Absolutely. And, sending messages that I don't trust you to be competent and that you can do things. And yeah, so that this one has a pretty powerful impact on relationships, more so than the other two.
All right, well, let's do the third one because I want to then ask you about relationships, about what happens, the impact of anxiety on our intimate relationships specifically. So the third one is the distorted beliefs. So what does this version, how does this one show up? What does it sound like?
Distorted belief is when we believe something negative to be true about ourselves that is in fact false. And when we're talking about distorted beliefs around anxiety, we're talking about really fundamentally core beliefs about who we are, as a person. Things like I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, I'm a failure, I'm an outsider, I'm a fraud. So these core beliefs that we hold about ourselves that we believe to be true when in fact they are false. I think of it as like looking through a funhouse mirror and believing that the image that you see back is an accurate reflection of your shape and form. And when we have distorted beliefs about ourselves, these false beliefs, they affect how we feel, but they also impact the way that we move through the world and interact with other people. So there will always be behaviors, many behaviors that we adopt that are designed to either conceal these beliefs from other people or to compensate for them. So, and these behaviors become part of the anxiety. So things like people pleasing, believing that the only way that somebody would possibly want to be in a relationship with me is if I agree to everything that they want to do and I never ask for anything for myself. Difficulty setting boundaries in relationships is, another way that shows up. Social anxiety is about distorted belief. Those, when you believe that you are being judged in some fundamental way. This shows up more like that social anxiety, or, I often will say that with distorted belief, there is anxiety, but there's often like some low level or more significant depression that's also present as well.
And I can see how the distorted beliefs version of this also fuels perfectionism.
It does.
Uh-huh. I imagine in some of these distorted beliefs, there are elements of truth, of course, because none of us is perfect. So
Right.
you could take any facet of self and find some evidence that that is true, but A, it's not the sum total of who you are, and B, it is larger inside of you than other people feel or than it needs to be. And it really does then crowd out other wonderful things that are also additionally true about who you are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to your point about perfectionism, we do absolutely see perfectionism here. And there is a distinction between how perfectionism shows up when it's coming from control and how it shows up when it's coming from distorted belief. And I would describe it this way. When your anxiety comes from control, the perfectionism is about, I have to do everything perfectly so that nothing bad happens. It's about trying to control the outcome. When we have perfectionism that comes from distorted belief, it's I have to be perfect so that I have value. It's more internal, that the need to be perfect is so that I have value and I have worth. Whereas when it's coming from control, the perfection is about making sure that nothing bad happens. So there's a different, way that presents and a different need that's driving that.
Super helpful. Okay, so what do you want to be whispering in the ear of somebody who's struggling with some distorted beliefs? So that's the manifestation for their anxiety. What do they need to hear and remember?
Yeah, so the work here is really about, first of all, understanding what those core beliefs are that are driving the anxiety or the depression, if that's also showing up. And then really working with them to help them identify something else, that could be true. This is like deep work that takes a lot of time. And we're never done with it. It's like something that these distorted beliefs will never go away. They're always going to be part of us because they often are rooted in our childhood experiences and the way that we've made sense of the world and our experiences. It's about really learning how to consider that something else might be true and coming to a new way of seeing yourself. And then learning how to move through the world, from the place of like this corrected belief rather than the distorted one. So the objection that we see with distorted belief is that, when we really believe these negative beliefs, we will find ways to deflect or to invalidate information and validation that comes to us from the outside world that actually tells us the truth of who we are. And we find ways to really keep that at a distance so that I don't internalize that and make that part of how I see myself. So it really is about learning to see all parts of yourself and making space for all of it, and really being able to come to see yourself in a different way, and also move through the world in a different way from that new perspective.
You know, what you're saying reminds me of Deb Dana's work around glimmers. Like that's so central, has become so central to her work on how we heal trauma is by helping people learning to take in little glimmers of something that is beautiful, that is available, that is bountiful. And that's what I hear you saying with these distorted beliefs is it's just, even if for a brief moment, entertaining a contrasting piece of data, and that those get, when distorted beliefs are in the driver's seat, contrasting pieces of data get pushed away or minimized or deflected or, not even coded. And so then I imagine you are working in a clinical relationship to help somebody notice something that is a contrasting little bit. And can you just sit with that? Sit
Yes, and
with
make
that little
space for
glimmer.
that. Yeah,
Mm-hmm,
that's exactly
mm-hmm.
right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about anxiety in intimate relationship dynamics. I'm imagining a scenario where one partner is struggling with anxiety, another partner isn't struggling with anxiety in that same way or at all, perhaps. Their flavor of life challenge is a little bit different. What do we want the anxious partner to remember and know about the impact of their anxiety on the relationship dynamic?
When I think about this, and I'm going to try to talk about this like, think about other ways that the anxiety shows up, but the one that really does have a profound impact on relationships is control. The thing that I do a lot of work with couples, and when there is this dynamic of one person having a lot of anxiety that shows up like control and the other person not, the things that I want them to start to understand, first of all, is how much their, sort of perfectionism or expectations about how things should be done, or even their experience of that I'm the one who's doing everything, like I'm doing too much, which is always true. They are always doing too much. And there are so many factors that play into that. And some of them, I'm so happy that we're talking about, like the mental load and emotional labor and, the ways that men and women are socialized different, and these gender defined roles that we used to have that has changed so much in what families look like today. And yet that division of labor has not, it's changed somewhat, but there's still this huge gap. All of that is so important. And I'm so glad that that is so much a part of our cultural conversation now. And for people who have anxiety rooted in control, there is also a piece of this, which is that they are not willing to let go. That needs to be named and addressed. And the first place that I start with them is just helping them understand that that actually is about anxiety. And, so really naming it that and working with them to use that word when they are talking to their partner. So instead of it needs to be done this way, or, it's I'm feeling uncomfortable or I'm feeling anxious, I would feel more comfortable if, or just to call it, I'm just feeling anxious right now, just to be able to name that. So that's one thing that I definitely work with the person who's carrying the anxiety around. And the second thing is that something I say a lot is that our goal here is not to get your partner to be anxious with you. Because so often
Yeah,
that
right.
is where the anxiety leads, is that they think that the only way that they can trust their partner is if they're carrying the same anxiety about all these things that they're carrying. And I, will always say that that cannot be the goal. That's not what we're trying to achieve here. So it does mean, and this is really hard, and I have so much empathy and compassion for the person in the couple who has anxiety. It is so hard to let go. It is so hard to trust. It is so hard, to do less and to sit in that discomfort. And there is work that needs to be done around that.
It is such a line that I'm hearing that you walk where in your wise to name, like there's a cultural component here. There's all kinds of gendered and cultural pieces. And then I think about social media and there's so much pressure. I'm thinking especially of, women and families with partners and raising kids. There's so much pressure on all of this, like sort of parenting inc, right? The incredible demand to do so much and these big kind of complicated mini corporations that couples are running. And so that's nothing that any individual person has created. And what you're saying is there's an intersection between the cultural messaging, the gender messaging, and your particular flavor of anxiety that shows up in a
They're
need to
both
control.
present,
So there's an important both and here. This is why the couple part is so important, is that then for the non-anxious partner needs to be learning about their partner's anxiety without then kind of wiping their hands and saying, this is all your anxiety. So there's that part as well. So can you talk to us then about the non-anxious partner's responsibility and positioning?
Yeah, because for them, like you do never want that to be dismissive of that's just your anxiety. So the thing that I really try to work with the other partner around is also understanding how much of what feels like demands, what feels like you're never doing it good enough, you're never doing it, right, is coming from anxiety. So, I do want to develop compassion for that in the other partner. And for them, there's a couple things with the other partner. And this is, Eve Rodsky's work around fair play and, some of this mental load and emotional labor. Her, how she breaks things down, that doing a task, there's like these different steps in doing a task. There's the conceptualization, the like recognizing that there's a task needs to be done. There's like how the pre-planning that goes into it, and there's the execution. And oftentimes partners come in at the execution phase and think that like I'm helping, I'm doing this. And there's often work with the partner around like, actually, you need to come in at the like conceptualization stage and the planning stage and the execution stage. So things like, well, who notices that we're out of paper towels, and who puts that on the shopping list? And, if you're only coming in where you're the one buying it at the store, like you're not doing enough of that labor. And so
the cognitive labor.
Exactly. So part of it is working with partners to like really own it from start to finish, like that, so that they're more involved. And a lot of times the reason that they become less involved is because the other partner struggles to let go. So there is, we're working on that. And then we're also like building compassion and helping them to step in a more complete way. And also like building the capacity to ask questions like about like, noticing when their partner seems anxious, when their partner seems, overwhelmed and stressed, and really coming to them in a way of like, I want to help you. And I see that, I see how overloaded you are right now. And, I'm thinking I could do this. Is there something else that would feel more helpful? But, just to be more, aware and connecting with them in those moments.
I'm thinking about when the anxious partner does let go or does kind of tolerate the B instead of the A plus plus, of just the anxious partner having a sense of pride that this is my healing, that I am doing less, that I am letting, and being careful that the non-anxious partner doesn't jump in and say, see, it wasn't that bad. See, it was,
Right.
But rather is also kind of celebrating, like, that's amazing. I'm really impressed that you were able to let that go. Like that can't have been easy. And I'm really impressed by that. Your ability to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that is so important.
Oh, Noelle, this has been a really rich conversation. Is there anything that you want to make sure that you leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
I think that's like the thing I would love to leave people with is knowing that you don't have to suffer with anxiety, that it is such a common experience for people. Everybody today knows, either is struggling with themselves or knows somebody who is. And, that's a whole other conversation about why, it's so prevalent today. But, that there really is a way in which you can find more peace and calm and not suffer. And, and I just want people to feel hope about that they, can find relief from it.
And absolutely working with a therapist, who's able to do this kind of work is a wonderful step. And your book is a wonderful companion. There are so many mindset shifts and practical tools that you have offered in your book. So I really, really recommend people read this and read it together. If you are in one of these relationships we've been talking about, where one of you does experience anxiety, the non-anxious partner can really benefit from reading your book as well and understanding how to be an ally and a partner in that experience.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Where can people find? Well, we're obviously going to have links in the show notes to your book, Anxiety Unpacked, Discover Your Type and Recover Your Peace. But what else do you want people to know about where they can connect with you?
They can email me, and you'll have to put this in the show notes because it's a mouthful and hard for people to understand like how to spell it, but at noellemcwardakino.com. My website is noellemcwardakino.com, and I'm also on Instagram at Noelle McWard Aquino.
All right. All that will be in the show notes. Thank you so much, Noelle.
Thank you, Alexandra. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Noelle, for this illuminating conversation. It is not easy work, but we can find more peace and more ease in our lives, particularly if we understand the nature of our anxiety more precisely by identifying its root cause and implementing strategies that align with that root cause rather than treating anxiety like a one-size-fits-all problem. I would love to hear your thoughts on today's conversation. So please, please, please leave a comment on YouTube or on Spotify to share, or submit a listener question to ask me about your specific story. You are going to find links to Noelle McWard Aquino's book, Anxiety Unpacked, Discover Your Type and Recover Your Peace. And you'll find out where to learn more about her work in the show notes. So until next time, be well. Thank you for listening to our show. Our producers are Mary Chan and Katie Pagich of Organized Sound Productions. Our theme music was composed by Slade Warnkin. The show is executive produced by me, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening, and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.